with a big thanks. Okay. With a big thanks to Lesley for coming here in Lisbon, even online, but coming here and talk a little bit about your work here, your latest work. And if you don't mind, I'm going to say one or two warnings in Portuguese, and then I will back to you, okay? Eu também gostava de agradecer aos presentes que estão-se a ligar e àqueles que entretanto vão chegando, a vossa disponibilidade para ouvirem a Lesley. E queria apenas dizer que se pudessem depois, durante a comunicação da Lesley, desligar o som e as câmaras, porque assim ela partilha e como a sessão está a ser gravada, fica mais, enfim, esteticamente mais bonita, além de ser melhor em termos técnicos. E por outro lado, se à medida que a Lesley for falando, se tiverem questões, podem ir escrevendo, porque depois nós fazemos a leitura no final das questões e assim será mais fácil de irmos arrumando essa parte do debate, porque a Lesley já nos referiu, já nos pediu, que eu gostaria imenso que as pessoas conversassem com ela sobre o projeto que ela está agora a desenvolver. Obrigadíssimo. Thank you, Lesley. I think you have understand a little bit. You haven't forgot your Portuguese, no? Yeah. Okay. So for those who don't know Lesley, she's currently working at Birkbeck in London University since 2011, I think. And she was a postdoctoral fellow at the University of Porto with a project entitled Material Culture as Architecture from the British Neolithic to the Portuguese Chalcolithic, and worked in preventive archaeology at Cambridge Archaeological Unit, where she excavated prehistoric landscape in East Anglia. She also have done some field work in Neolithic context of the Orkney Islands, and in Normandy, in long barrows of Dorset, Normandy, and Britain, and in walled enclosures with us in the Portuguese Alto Douro. His work focus on the recent prehistory of the British Isles, France and Portugal, and it covered themes of prehistoric architecture and the history of ideas between archaeology and architecture. For example, as an example, in the walled enclosures of the Chalcolithic, and I think this is important for us, from the School of Archaeology in the north of Portugal, in the walled enclosure of the Chalcolithic, she starts to think, rather than thinking in traditional terms about a building and its subsequent use, she uses his work on pottery to refocus the issues and think of occupation as a precedent for architectural design, so that building designs are a series of creative activities that emerge from the rhythm and timing of occupation. It was a very important work for us, that work in prehistory in the north of Portugal. So she's currently thinking about on the redefinition of design practice and creativity in prehistory, participating in design studio, teaching in the architecture department. But today, I think she's going to talk about her latest work, and entitled, as you are going to see, Dead Hives and Drumadoon Farm, a tale of two projects on heritage ecologies in Scotland. So thank you very much, Lesley. And
thank you, João. And can you just shout that the screen share works?
It works, yes. Okay.
Okay. Okay, so I'll start. As João said, I'm a prehistorian and I've worked on the Neolithic and Bronze Age in Britain, France, and Portugal. However, current archaeological research is based back home where I grew up in Ayrshire in Scotland. And I started doing this work before the pandemic. And it's more than prehistory. And I want to explain why tonight it's more than prehistory and how it brings together archaeology, art, and ecology. I know that one of the themes of your seminar series are interdisciplinary projects, and I want to talk about how this is an interdisciplinary project in order to focus on matter that's been overlooked or actively ignored. These are not the idyllic landscapes of our national poet, Robert Burns, who is depicted in the graffiti here on a seawall. He also grew up in Ayrshire. And the landscapes that I'm going to speak about tonight are not those that most Scottish people revere or remember. Let's start with the Ardair Peninsula on the mainland. So I'm going to be talking about just this part here of Scotland, and then we're going to jump over to the island of Arran in the second part. And in this old historical map of the Ardair, you can see the town of Ardrossan, which is where you still get the ferry over to the island of Arran. So they're very close together. So later we'll cross the water to the Isle of Arran. Ardair was also an island in prehistory, but it's now a peninsula bounded by river and sea. In 1871, Alfred Nobel started building a dynamite factory here for the manufacture of black powder, safety fuse, and detonators. It was the largest explosives factory in the world. In order to make it, the sand dunes along the shoreline were resculpted and the areas of dune were cleared so that light wood buildings could be raised and then the sand mounded around each of these structures. This was done to isolate danger zones to each building within the factory. Here it is now. And Neolithic and Bronze Age ancient land surfaces are redeposited and they're caught up in these mounds that were around the buildings. The antiquarian John Smith, who was there at the time of the factory's construction, wrote, "Here and there amongst the duns, we can still detect patches of a black soil resting on sand." Smith also collected the flint tools that were uncovered during the construction work, the most frequent of which were scrapers, awls, and borers. The wooden structures of the factory have now been dismantled, but the mounds, you can see that the mounds are still there, and they've now become the fixed dune grassland habitats on which uncommon moonwort grows, and in which rare bees and wasps buzz with life. In fact, in this area of the Ardair, there's the largest colony of these very rare bees and wasps. Leafcutter, polyester and blood bees, spider hunting and digger wasps. And to be honest, these other lives, they had started their occupation as soon as the wooden buildings and sand mounds had been erected for the dynamite factory, because human access was very tightly controlled during the time of the factory. ICI further developed the site from 1926, extending the development inland to cover the whole of the peninsula to an area of 331.5 hectares. This is a painting from 1958, and I include it to just show you how busy and how occupied by this factory the whole of the peninsula was. There were production buildings, nitrating houses, and dynamite cartridging huts, and these were accompanied by administrative buildings, a library, a canteen, laboratories, testing ranges, and a work manager's house. There was a bank and a travel agent. There were colliery shafts, gasworks, a nitric acid plant, boiler and engine rooms. The infrastructure ranged from a power station road and narrow gauge railway with marshalling yard and station to a harbour. Up to 13,000 local people worked at the factory. And I stress again that they were local people. In 1884, 10 girls and women were killed in Cartridge Hut 7. And in 1914, 8 men were killed in a gelatin mixing house. It was incredibly dangerous work, and others were killed, and there are other accidents listed too. Chemring still make pyrotechnics and detonators in one area of the site, and there are now 4 sand quarries biting into the black powder wood. In this photograph, you can see the old labs from Nobel and ICI. Can you see these buildings here, left to decay? And there are also the pine trees that were planted to screen the factory and fire pond from other areas of the site. So this was the pine planted forest. And then you can see here that there's birch and willow that's extended in and taken over the ground that was between the labs and the original woodland. It's just regenerated itself through the decay of the buildings. Because the wood receives no management, wind-blown trees lie where they fall. Many other dead trees remain standing, and the abundance of this dead wood provides food for many invertebrates. So now we have really rare species of beetles living within this woodland, like 2-banded longhorns and the red-brown longhorn beetle. Most of the peninsula is currently due for further development by NPL Group, a privately owned brownfield regeneration company. And so although we have this, these ecologically rare habitats, they're being ignored because it looks like a nasty industrial landscape, and it's being termed brownfield without any concern. This is despite the fact that there are a mosaic of environments from embryo dunes on the beach, through mobile dunes and fixed dunes further inland, and dune heath, dune slack and dune scrub, also to the birch-dominated dune woodland at this landward extremity of the site. There are also incredibly rare wetland habitats, and also this is where there are the remains of prehistoric wooden-built crannogs that John Smith wrote about in his letters. As well as now terming the site brownfield, you can see these security fences that have appeared within the landscape. These are being erected and they've started to be patrolled to keep people out. Historic Environment Scotland have produced a short history of Alfred Nobel's dynamite factory. And in this publication, there are many historic photographs of the factory buildings. And in several of these photographs, the buildings are occupied by the people that work there. But none of the workers are named, and none of the workers are named in the captions. And these people are not the subject of the photographs of the publication. They're just there because they were working in the room at the time. The Canmore records for the larger site, Canmore are the Historic Environment Scotland official archives, state that, and I quote for this landscape, "Today the site has been more or less cleared of the historic structures to do with the original 1871 factory and the subsequent expansion and the rebuilding of the ICI site until the 1990s. But the buildings are here. Between the publication on the factory and the statement in the archive record, there are far too many buildings that have been missed out and far too many lives, human and non-human. the women that were working in the factories, and the rare habitats for the wasps and the bees and the beetles. A request was made in 2019 for an archaeological survey of the peninsula, but this was turned down as there's a 1953 special development order on the site that negates archaeological intervention. At the same time, a local campaign is underway for Nature Scotland to make the habitat sites of special scientific importance due to the fauna and flora that now thrive here. But this has been delayed, and it's proving difficult to get designated due to the fact that there are a mosaic, a variety of different environments, and because threaded through this is the industrial character of these habitats. It doesn't look right for nature. For over 10 years, the photographer Alex Boyd, who I now work with, has been photographing the site of Ardare. In the northern area of what was the ICI factory, cordite press houses were constructed from 1940 onwards. Munitionettes, so cordite's where you're making dynamite, munitionettes worked there. The buildings were constructed from a core of reinforced concrete, providing compartmentalisation within the press houses, with the entire structure then enclosed by sand mounds, in the same way that the light wood buildings had been with Alfred Nobel. Each bay would have contained a cordite press, which extruded cordite paste onto a table for cutting into lengths. The presses were driven from motors situated in the long corridor at the back. Inside the units where the women worked, cutting cordite paste, the walls of the building are covered with penciled graffiti, often scrawled around where fittings once were. The graffiti dates from 1941 onwards. The pencils were work pencils because clothes and belongings were controlled due to the dangers of working with cordite. So they had aprons that they had to put on in the outer buildings, and shoe mufflers, and they were given a pencil for recording, and then they would walk towards their building. One of the most common forms of graffiti, along with the numerous head portraits, group lists of women's names and work numbers, are the full lyrics to songs. But first of all, I just want to show you the women's names and how they've produced them in circles and in groupings of the teams that they worked with. So often you get the women's names in a group of 6, or you get the women's names in a group of 4 or 3, but how they're not only listed together as a team, they bind them with the pencil drawings. Okay, the songs. These are the full lyrics to songs. So it's not a couple of lines, they've written out the entire lyrics to a song. There are 15 songs written out in full by hand, from Bing Crosby to Vera Lynn, from If I Had My Way to Close to You. Written on the painted walls, and also written on the plaster where the paint had been removed. The lyrics are always about love, but also of touch and separation and time. There are also lots of references to nature, including seas, rocks, shores, stars, and birds. One song refers to sand, but this one exists on the walls of the press house as only one line. So the rest are the full lyrics, and there is one song that's one line. A red, red rose. It has a border of pencil roses drawn around it. It is also the only song that is not from the 1940s. It was written by Robert Burns in 1794, who was born and worked for many years in Ayrshire. Remember, I said that he's the national poet of Scotland. He was born in Ayrshire, and everyone that has grown up in Ayrshire has learned his poems and songs by heart in school in order to recite them. We start from age 5 with the small poems, and we work up to the 13-page ones by the age of 12. And we recite them in competitions for Burns Night. So as soon as Alex and I saw this line, we could recite, because it's still up here, the full song. I have, and like the munitionettes, who are all local workers, only the need of a line in order to be able to sing the song in full. It's memorised. I'll give you a verse. Till all the seas gang dry, my dear, and the rocks melt wi' the sun, I will love thee still, my dear, while the sands of life shall run. The other songs on the walls were most probably written out so that the women could remember the lyrics, share them, and sing them together. What is important is that this is an architecture that invites occupation. The women are known, they're in teams, they're named, and they're vocal. They are not invisible or absent, and they are not silent. The brick and concrete cordite press buildings are still standing, and fragments of the wartime windows remain in place, despite those records from Historic Environment Scotland. But there is more and more contemporary spray paint graffiti covering the pencil marks in each of the rooms. And Alex has been photographing the site over 10 years, and you can see more and more being covered by spray paint graffiti. Former changing rooms and other areas in the buildings have been burnt out or smashed up. However, can you see the gorse and the broom growing around the buildings and the sand? These extensive tracts of gorse and broom, which surround the buildings and the sand mounds, are the habitats for nesting songbirds. And there are some incredibly rare nesting songbirds here now, from lesser whitethroat to linnet and greenfinch. Singing women and singing birds. This is not a story that ends with decay, and we need to create a new kind of accounting for memory and place. Our project also needs to be as vocal as it can be, as well as visual. And so future work involves a local artist singing the songs again in the building. And hopefully this will be Eddie Reader, who is a local folk singer from Irvine, but also working with 2 sound artists who will record from the buildings out to the sand dunes onto the river and sea foreshores, so that other species are caught up in the recordings in order to highlight the biodiversity in the different dune systems that are there. The anthropologist Anna Singh writes, I look for disturbance-based ecologies in which many sometimes live together without either harmony or conquest. So it's not about one over the other. It's not about even a harmony between them. It's about accounting for this interwoven assemblage of many kinds of life. And it can look ugly. These are cultural and natural landscapes that are interwoven with a human and non-human presence, be it in the relations between what was and is mound and dune, ancient land surface and sand, lab building and forest and birch regeneration. These are occupations that are there that involve Neolithic, Bronze Age, 19th century, Second World War, and contemporary chronologies, involving temporal durations that span from the working year of the munitionettes, an evening's recce with a spray can, summer nesting season for songbirds, and the length of time it takes to sing a song. The Ardere is not a dead isle, but a mosaic of occupations involving many species. The Ardere is not a story that ends with decay, though decay is actually an important condition for its future and for the survival of the bees and the wasps and the beetles and the songbirds. That future also depends on how we bring together archaeology, art, and ecology, and how we make things matter together. Alex and I are now working with the ecologist Ian Hamlin, whose knowledge and direct familiarity with the other species is woven into this presentation. We care together. This is a project about how to hold on to the memories of those that worked here, who were so vocal whilst alive, but are so silent in the archive, whilst also protecting the habitats and lives of birds and beetles that require people to stay out of the way. That's why they're there. Many of the local community had family members that worked in the factory, and they care about this still. This is from the Ardrossan and Saltcoats Herald, and you can see that a musical was put on about the women that died, well, girls 14 to 24 in Cartridge Hut 7. It's from April 2022. This is also an incredibly deprived area in Scotland. It's from very poor areas, with the need for new jobs and the need for new infrastructure. But this community are the one that is so vocal in their care for these rare habitats that have developed from the effects of the factory. It was local NGOs that called on Nature Scotland and the RSPB, it's the Royal Society for the Protection of Birds, to care for the habitats and the havens at Ardere. And this one made the national news. It's cut off, but it's from the BBC, you know, the big institution in Britain. So this is about singing women and singing birds, their presence and the importance of heritage ecologies. And I think it's important for me not to call this archaeology, but to think about heritage ecologies, especially in overlooked and decaying industrial landscapes, and about how to bring them to the fore. And you can only really bring them to the fore through a kind of interdisciplinary work in order to value these kinds of landscapes and the stories that can be told about them. In 2019, whilst Alex and I were undertaking walkovers of the Ardere landscape, Historic Environment Scotland, who couldn't do any work at Ardere, they were in the air in airplanes producing a LiDAR survey of the Isle of Arran, which is where my family are from. So you can see here, Ardere was here, and it's just a short trip on the ferry over the water to this small island here. And what was amazing about this survey was it was of the entire island. The survey revealed over 1,000 previously unknown sites, one of which was a possible Neolithic Cursus monument, which is a landscape scale architecture. So it was found here on the eastern side of the island at Blackwater Foot. And you can see that it's a double bank. Often they have ditches, but this one doesn't seem to. But they're a landscape scale architecture. This one's over 1 kilometre in length. And there are not many within Scotland. You get lots around the Stonehenge landscape, but not many in Scotland. The Cursus is located on the higher ground between two bays that are Blackwater Foot and Machrie Moor. and its northernmost end looks down onto the Machrie Moor monumental complex that most people know for prehistory on the island. So this is the Blackwater Foot Bay, and this is the Machrie Moor Bay, and the Machrie stone complex of standing stones in circle settings is here. And the monument is parallel along the higher ground, and it's not at its northernmost point. It looks down on, and you can actually see the monuments of Machrie Moor, which are here. They're pretty spectacular. In 2021, Kenny Brophy, Gavin McGregor, and some of you will recognise Mark Knight and I, excavated a slot through the eastern bank of the Cursus at its southern end, so at the end that's near, that's not in a scheduled area, and it's on the land that is a part of Drumadoon Farm. So to begin with, we came in on this project as prehistorians to check that this was a Neolithic monument, and the story of Drumadoon Farm on which it's located didn't really mean anything to us to begin with. In the slot that we excavated, we found worked flint, worked quartz, and worked pitch stone. Pitch stone is only sourced on Arran, and it travelled throughout the Neolithic from Ireland to mainland Scotland up to Orkney and Shetland. It was incredibly valued. So this was a Neolithic monument. We were only finding prehistoric artefacts. So we returned again the following year, last year in the summer, to do a larger slot and to look at the construction of the Cursus Bank. The Cursus monument is not only rare in that it exists in this part of Scotland, it's the first one that's ever been located on an island, but it's also unique in having a stone and an earthen built component. Normally they're built only of stone, or they're built of turf and earthen materials. And you can see here, we didn't get to the bottom, but you can see the base is made of these large slabs of rhyolite in the end, to a depth about this that we have. Then there are turf stacks, some supported by timber settings, we think, and then further earthen material thrown up over. And so far, we haven't found an outer ditch to this bank. The other thing, Jean has said about how I'm interested in settlement and never understanding monumentality for its own sake or for its own construction, but how it comes out of the rhythm of living and settlement. And there's very little known about the environments or the settlement for these monuments within the island. So our work is accompanied by a project of augering the soils, looking for ancient land surfaces, and then to get the paleoenvironmental information from these soils. And this work is led by Emma Jenkins and Nikki Whitehouse. But we've also, within that, been targeting features and excavating slots through them in order to look for ancient land surfaces below them. And we're interested in mapping the location and the extent of those ancient land surfaces. So you can, this is the area where we worked last year, you can see that we had picked up in the LiDAR survey this field boundary that was at a funny angle to the medieval and post-medieval field boundaries. So we targeted it and we found an ancient land surface below it, which we've sampled, and then we augured out from it because we're interested in its extent. And as well as the invaluable paleoenvironmental information that these ancient land surfaces give us, We're also, and this is the bit I'm interested in and doing, is we're interested in test pitting these deposits to record the density and the distribution of artifacts at scale, because we want to know where people are and concentrations in the landscape of where people were in the Neolithic. We're also attempting to date these deposits because the few excavations that there have been on the island haven't got much dated material. In fact, the few legacy dates that we do have are from Machrie Moor itself. It's lovely Machrie Moor. You can see it's in this kind of depression straight from the bay, and then it leads up right through the mountains to the north of the island. And you can see one of the stone complexes here. At Machrie Moor, we know from previous excavations that the peat is dated to about the 1st millennium BC. So the peat formation starts from the Iron Age. And we're also interested in how thick the deposits of peat are, because we're interested in climate change and issues of carbon capture and sustainability for the future of the island. But we're also after these ancient land surfaces beneath the peat. Some have been found at Tormore, which is right next to Machrie Moor, and they were dated to the late Neolithic. So they predate the hut circles that are around with the monuments, but they are late Neolithic. And some ard marks were also found in that ancient land surface. The hut circles, the house deposits that have been excavated at Tormore, we've got dates from the early to middle Bronze Age or the middle to late Bronze Age. So the monuments, there's a late Neolithic ancient land surface that's contemporary with the monuments, but the hut circles that have been excavated are slightly later, they're Bronze Age, and then the peat is over the top of it all, developing from the Iron Age. But from those house deposits at Tormore, there was barley, which was a major crop at the time, and they also had cultivated emmer wheat, and bread wheat was in the vicinity too. So although it's slightly later in date, it is telling us that we have a farming landscape that these monuments are a part of and then become more a focal point for. But we don't know the distribution yet or the density of the settlement activity, and it's that we're focusing on now. It's clear that the area around the cursus had been extensively cut over for peat, and I'll come back to this in a minute. So we'd started to find a historic activity of the cutting of the peat that had started from the Iron Age. We know that the peat postdates the monuments across this landscape. Drumadoon Farm is owned by David Bennett, and it's part of the Northwoods rewilding network. And it took a while, but especially last year, Gavin McGregor from Arqueology Scotland and I started to get really interested in this. Drumadoon Farm consists of farmland, coastal cliffs and shorelines, scrub, woodlands and heather moor. You can even see the native aspen trees that have been left to regenerate over the site over the last 80 years. So here's the shoreline, and unusual for an island, there's this stretch of aspen, and aspen are native trees to the island that are beginning to move inland because they've been left to themselves for 30 years. And this is important because it's a native Scottish rainforest that's redeveloping, and it's unlike the human-made forest that's mechanically constructed for timber and leaves terrible scarring in the landscape. The sea cliffs that are starting to be recovered and recolonised by the aspen, the sea cliffs are nesting sites for seabirds, and the moorland that you can see in a beautiful purple from the heather flower is the home to red deer, short-eared owls, buzzards, kestrels, and hen harriers. So in the gap between the prehistory and the historic record, and then another gap very recently in the last 30 years, there are these incredibly rare habitats now for birds and for woodland. The next move by David is to replace the forest plantations with more native trees and to put in water features to benefit wildlife. And an education and events centre will be out of the wood from the old forest plantation. So he's going to remove this forest plantation, but build out of it an education centre and visitor centre that will promote the benefits of native native trees and mixed woodland, and how you can manage that in a more sustainable way for building and for profit on the island. The other thing about David Bennett, he convinced Gavin McGregor and I to join up with Arran Geopark. And we're in the process of linking the rewilding and the archaeological and the geological heritage to create a new kind of regenerative tourism. So nothing would work on its own on this island, but if the three of us work together, you can create more interest on the island and create more sustainable jobs that aren't just from March to September and then you lose your job and have to be off island. You can have a job for the year, for your life, and live there with your family. And I want to tell you a bit about what I've learned about that geology and how my interest has got deeper. The shoreline is Triassic. It's 250 million years old, and there are surviving dinosaur footprints that you can visit. Here, this is a Drumadoon Point, and you can see that it stands up in a kind of column-like way. The spectacular columns of Drumadoon Point were formed from quartz feldspar porphyry, and there's also an Iron Age hill fort and enclosure on the top. It's pretty spectacular. There is also rock art dating from the Neolithic through to the early medieval. Here you can see Gavin's pointing the torch at Ogham inscription. So it's a 4th to 9th century AD language shared between Ireland and the Scots. There is also an incredibly rare, there are also dogs and deer. And this beautiful 18th and 19th century ink graffiti. So think about that, you're drawing with the fluid ink, and they're drawing it at the back of the cave where there's the flow stone, the water drips. So it's a fluid form of graffiti on a fluid surface. But what's really interesting here is it started to make me think about the Coa Valley and how it goes from the Neolithic right through to the contemporary. And we know from the Alto Douro the number of enclosures there are. So the rock art and the enclosures remind me of the Alto Douro, where I worked before with many of you who are listening. And it would be good to develop connections with the Endangered Landscape Programme in the Coa Valley to this one that is part of Northwoods and Scotland's Big Picture. But also how in that work in the Coa Valley, how it's archaeological and ecological and cultural and natural too. So the work with Coa Landcraft, Coa Corredor das Artes, and Rewilding Portugal. I want to talk a little bit about rewilding in Scotland, though. We have to be very sensitive to the politics of rewilding in Scotland. It was not that long ago that people were cleared from the land to make way for sheep and deer by the landowners. It is very important that Drumadoon is a small-scale rewilding project and that it is archaeological and ecological. So if in the Ardeer Peninsula, it's about adding the ecological into the archaeological, here in Arran, it's very important to add the archaeological into the ecological, if that makes sense. It needs to pay attention to a cultural and a natural landscape. And this is why Gavin McGregor and I are also interested in the archaeology of the farm itself. This is Drumadoon Farm. Because in the 18th century, John Burrell was commissioned by the Duke of Hamilton to bring an end to communal run-rig farming that was done by islanders. And workers from the mainland were brought over to construct turf dyke enclosures for the lotting of the island into large farms that weren't to be farmed by the islanders. It was also, the first step of it was about the restriction of hill grazing and peat cutting for fuel for the islanders. And I want to show you that turf enclosure. You can see it running right through the landscape, separating the uplands from the lowlands and stopping access to islanders for peat, for cutting fuel, for hunting, for game, and for allowing their sheep and the few cows they had from having common land pasture within the summer months. So it cut off a resource, and then the land that could be farmed was also enclosed, and they were removed from that as well. Drumadoon Farm was one of the first tenancy farms in Ireland, on the island. You can see archaeologically remnants of this. I always wondered why it had such grand gate posts to the start of it. The house was built in 1820. Locals were not given these farms, but were instead evicted from the island from 1812 to 1815. And think about how near in time that is. I always think of the clearances as the 1740s. Somehow the fact that this is 1812 to 1815 hurts. The only historical records of the families that were removed, there are no historical records for the families that were moved from Drumadoon and Blackwater Foot. The only historical records of families that were removed are from Sannox and Lamlash on the eastern side of the island. And this was only because the Duke of Hamilton gave these people passage to Canada. So he wanted the names of those that owed him money, and that's why there's a historical record. He also only paid for half of their passage. So they were already indebted and in debt before they had even landed in Canada. You can see the material traces, though, of the islanders in their peat cuts in those uplands. And so archaeology can get at the stories of those that were evicted. It's not a very good photograph, but there's a peat theme here. Peat was cut into blocks and then stacked and dried and used for fuel. And there's a peat seam here. You were given a family seam that you would a family cut that you would maintain. There's a seam here. And what's really interesting is it stops and respects, can you see in the ferns, a hut circle from the Bronze Age. So you've got this juxtaposition of historical and Bronze Age archaeology on the uplands. You can also see it when we were excavating the Cursus monument. Can you see these cuts of the peat? So the peat, we knew from the augering that the peat was denuded around this area, but we also found the peat cutting marks of where they came historically right up to the Cursus monument and stopped. And we also found the peat cutting tools in the old farm buildings when we were staying there. It is incredibly important to engage with this archaeology and make these lives matter, as well as to value the peat and the heath more for a better future for deer and for short-tailed owls and for carbon capture. They're interwoven together. I read you a verse from Robert Burns at Ardare from the 18th century. I want to read you a verse from a 19th century poem that was written on the island by someone who's anonymous, that's called That I Was There. Roofless the walls, and all around is dreary. Cold the Ingleside and bare. Men called it home. 'Tis now the wild birds' eyrie. Yet I would that I were there. We'll carry out further survey work to try and identify areas of run rig farming that was the communal farming before it was enclosed. And we'll undertake targeted excavation of historical features. And this one, this photograph hangs in the bar of the Blackwater Foot Hotel called the Kinloch. I've seen it since I was a child and always looked at it. And my uncle told me that it was of Jimmy and Jenny Neal, who lived right on the shoreline at Blackwater Foot. So I went and did a survey and I found the remains of it. And why this is important is the shoreline didn't belong to the tenant farmers, and the shoreline didn't belong to the Duke of Hamilton. So this couple have made a small home there, but they also collected whelks. They made their living from shellfish that didn't belong to anyone and couldn't be controlled, and they sold them to the locals for food. And it's these overlooked lives that I think it's important for islanders that we focus on and not just do a prehistoric research excavation from the university that comes in and out and leaves. In line with that, one of the things that I'm doing is setting up a community field walking project that's for islanders. There was an artist and flint collector called Fiona Gorman who died recently, but Nairi Finlay at the University of Glasgow collected up for the Hunterian Museum in Glasgow her collection. And from that, we're going to make a series of teaching boxes that will take back to the island to educate and train people up in identifying worked flint, teach them how to record in field walking, but to run the project from themselves. And also, this is probably where we'll get the most historic material as well, rather than just prehistoric. I'm going to speed up a bit now because I'm obviously going on. What I want to say is that rewilding cannot be part of another act of erasure. It can instead engage materially with the human past and protect non-human futures at the same time. The farm also offers a more sustainable future for the island. For example, the barley it grows is for the local distillery at Lag, where they make the whisky. There are also more sustainable herds for the local food chain. And even though there are sheep, which Maddie loved lots, that's my daughter, they're for the island, they're for the local food network and stopping things having to come over from the mainland. And again, here there are things to learn from the Douro and the connections between the wine and rewilding. And also what I learned and loved when I worked in the Douro, the local cheeses and the local produce, and bringing that in to knowledge of heritage and archaeology for tourism looking forward, that can be connected up with Arran. To end, I suppose I started in Arran, my own island that I'm from, as a prehistorian, and I extended the prehistory spatially from Drumadoon to Machrie Moor. However, the interdisciplinary nature of this project, bringing together archaeology, ecology, and geology, has shown me the importance of extending the project in time, right up to very near time, and committing to an archaeology of care. For there is also an abandoned farm at Machrie. And what's really interesting is the farm at Machrie is just outside of the area that's scheduled and protected. Why isn't that part of the archaeology that we're interested in? As the poem said, we cannot leave these Inglesides cold, and we cannot leave them bare. Not anymore. Thank you.
Thank you, Lesley. It was very impressive and interesting. I will open now. I have some questions, but I prefer to give someone, or there are someone already trying to speak. Maria Leonor. Queres que eu mude? Leonor?
Sorry, I was just congratulating the presentation. It wasn't a question, sorry.
Thank you.
As well, I'm just going to say one or two things very, very, very synthetic, in a synthetic way. I have already, I really enjoyed your communication, and I think it's a silly thing we don't work together, because the amount of similarities that you talk about that are in the Iceland and in Douro, it's amazing. So I think we are open, everyone who works in Douro Valley are open to think about something that we can do it together. So that is a yes. And another thing that it's very, 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 it is a detail. Just the curses that you talk about, it's open to the landscape. You haven't found nothing that could cover it, or just kind of a structure.
Yeah. So the cursus itself, it has an end on this. There's more of an end on the southern part than the northern part. But anyway, they're probably for walking along the side. Yes. So it's not really closed in the Neolithic. But the other thing is that whatever the farming practices were in the Bronze Age, they depleted the soils. So we've got very poor soils showing. And that upland becomes a relict Bronze Age landscape. It's frozen. I can't go back to the photograph. You can see where we've put her section through the cursus. On the inner side of the bank, there's a kind of stone platform that's from the Bronze Age, probably. We haven't dated it yet, but it's probably from the Bronze Age. So they're extending it and using it in the Bronze Age. But then the peat forms, and then no one can farm up there. It becomes relict. And the only people, there's a gap then, the only people that come back are those in the historic period who cut the peat for fuel or to graze their animals, and they respect and don't destroy that prehistoric landscape. So yeah, it stays open. You can walk it, you can still walk it. Yeah.
Okay, and just for a final thought, I was wrong, because I think you are still working in this with the same problems and questions that you started to work a few years ago. Archaeology, landscapes, memories, the entanglement of natural and cultural landscapes. I think it's different ways to see the landscape, and it shows the way that we as field archaeologists work to the landscape, and we put layers and layers of reflection, and then I think we always come back to the problems that are important for us as a prehistorians, I think.
I don't know if it's the danger of working in a landscape where you grew up, and so you care who gets to do the archaeology and what the archaeology's for. But more and more, there's the need to do that archaeology of the contemporary. But the thing that's not me doing my prehistory is having to learn about how to connect archaeology and rewilding together. And I think it's more developed and being done really well in the Coa Valley, because there are problematic projects in Scotland, in the Highlands, that talk about bringing Scotland back to nature and to a Scottish forest from the Neolithic. And the small Highland communities that work in that area, so there was the massive clearances in the 17th and 18th century, they're now almost being cleared again by the need to love nature and rewild. And I'm scared of getting it wrong. I'm scared of getting it wrong because the clearances were in the 1812 to 1815s in the island that I'm from, and we don't know the names of the families. The idea of doing it again and not creating a cultural and working environment for people to, I don't care if they were born on the island, they can come from anywhere, but so that they can live there for as long as they want to live and not just be there from March to September. Getting that balance politically right is really important. And that yeah, I'm nervous talking about it because I don't know how to do it yet. And I think joining up projects where they definitely use the archaeology, so in the Coa Valley, where they're using the archaeology as well as doing the rewilding, it's important.
Yes, we in the area that we are working in the Coa Valley, we had the same the same concerns about the rewilding and the heritage, and the people who worked there all their life, and now they are seeing different things happening in their landscape. So it's important to have a equilibrium between what they are doing and what are you doing, I think.
Yeah.
I think it's important for you. I don't know if someone wants to talk, to say something, to ask a question, to a comment. I don't want to monopolize the old Lesley.
I would like to speak, if that's okay. Thank you so much. Yeah, are you hearing me okay?
Yeah.
Thank you so much, Lesley. It was really inspiring to hear about your projects. I really like to hear about this, I think we can call it a holistic approach to heritage and to landscape. And I think more and more we need to start thinking about research in archaeology this way, not only about going to excavate prehistoric sites, as you were saying, and then, okay, thank you, see you next year. But I also understand when you say that it's hard to know or to find what should be the place in archaeology nowadays. How can we use archaeology for this, for the concerns of local communities, for the promotion of sustainable landscapes? And I think it's very inspiring to see that you are struggling with this, that you know that the answers are not easy, but you are working and you're trying things out. So thank you so much. I think this has opened a lot of ideas for me. But I wanted to ask you if you were saying that you were going to try to include local population, locals in the fieldwalking in the future. But I was wondering if you so far have been able to include people in the archaeology activities, and what are your experiences with this?
So we've only done in Arran, we've only done a very, very small excavation, and we had so the first year we ran the project, we invited a group from Jambo Radio to come and work with us. They're not in the picture, it's just the picture I chose. But so these are young people from North African backgrounds, Scottish North African backgrounds, who have a North African Scottish radio station in the city, in Glasgow and in Edinburgh. And we approached them because these are the people who don't get on the ferry and come walking in the hills. And we wondered why. And we thought if we did the excavation with them and did a tour of the museums and of the landscape, maybe we could get other people to come to the island. So, that was the first part, and we're now applying for funds to embed them within the excavation team. Probably more, because there's only so many slots you can put within a Cursus monument. Yeah. Probably more to do some of these other excavations that I talked about in the cave site for the rock art, and the bothy that's on the shoreline, and maybe the hill fort. But the other is that the islanders would come for a day to visit the site and ask, can't we excavate too? And so the first thing is to, I think, is to bring the school children from the island into the project to work with us. It's on the uplands, so it's not very accessible for the elderly, and yet the elderly care more about the stories of those working farms, so that everybody knows there's a story of Drumadoon about why it's not been farmed for the last 30 years. It was a failed farm. And there are others in that Shiskin Valley that are the same, because John Burrell, who came over in the 18th century, he made his map before he came to the island. So the land that he carved up was not necessarily good quality. But they'll be in field walkings in the valley, on the flat. You'll find pottery and building materials from the working heritage of the farms that are still standing, and those like the one at Machry that have gone out of use and are ruined, and then back to the historic period in the 19th century where the only story we can tell of the families that were evicted is materially. There is no historical record of them. That's where archaeology is of value, when it can do something materially to tell a story, when textual records can. And okay, I have to be careful. Maybe this is me as a prehistorian talking. I don't normally work with texts, but that's a big thing, right? And that's one of the places to start.
Thank you very much.
I think Clara wants to say something. Please do.
Lara, you're muted.
Oops, sorry. I just wanted to say hello to Lesley and many thanks for such an inspiring presentation. It was wonderful, and thank you for, you know, taking us on this journey to Aran. It was beautiful and with so much to tell. You know, the land has so much to tell us and so many tales. And congratulations also for the findings of the curses, which is, well, amazing for historians. And I just wanted to reiterate what João just said. We are working with such a similar you know, mindset. I don't want to say framework, which is too squared, but in such a similar mindset, and you know the reality of the Coa Valley and the Douro. So it just makes sense to invite you today to come over, and we perhaps could, you know, think of a joint project, because we are actually working with the local populations, with schools, with local communities, hearing their stories about the land in a rewilding territory. So we are so close, so well, far apart, but so close in terms of what our aims and our ideas of archaeology is. That yes, I wanted to invite you to come over and perhaps, you know, try to work out, re-engage in our work with a bit of brainstorming.
Let's do it. I got in touch with the Endangered Landscape Programme, but their connection is in the Cairngorms in the Highlands with the Port Valley, and they don't have any. So they have internal knowledge exchange funds, but not external. Unfortunately, our project is external.
All right. Okay.
We'll find a way. We'll find a
way of. Yeah, we should find a way. And thank you so much. It was
Thank you, Lara. I was going to say I also need to learn from Alexandra, because so there's a museum on the island, and but there's also a group who study place names and the naming of things and knowing things through naming. And I know that that's a strong part of Alexandra's work, and that's where I don't know how to do things. But
yeah,
but they want to connect up that work with a bigger project too.
So Alexandra, you're in.
I'll learn from her in September at the European Association.
We'll talk about it in Belfast, right?
Yeah.
We can talk about it a little more.
But the naming of places, Alexandra, I'm going to say it badly, the naming of places is very important and has a time depth to it that overlaps these periods where there aren't the historical records for people.
Well, yeah, the more I read about it, the more I think it's really important for us to know more about the place names and their connection with the archaeological sites or the landscape, because it's such a great information. The more you dig up the documents, the more information you get, and you can connect all sorts of things. So it's like your work, like your presentation. It's just so many areas you can and themes, different themes that you can research. So I'm not very inspired today, but we can talk about
No,
it.
completely. So, for example, there are some old words in the name for valley or bay or town in the names in Arran. But what's really interesting is the Gaelic language. The Gaelic language only exists now for the names of the mountains. And that's really interesting. It's really sad, but it's really interesting. But the other thing is how Sarah said, how do we make these things matter? And one of the other ways, Sarah, I think, to make these things matter is when you delve in. When I was working with the students last summer on an art project with the archaeology, I started to read them poetry from the island and the folk tales. And the folk tales mention the names of the places. They mention some of the material remains, but they also tell stories that draw them in. And there's an ecological connection there too. So there's a creature called the Stratavaig, and the Stratavaig, you had to give her libations of milk every day, leave them in a bowl, or your cows would be stricken ill or stolen. And they were like, oh my goodness, what is this story? And then they started to draw them, and they started to think about cattle. And there are also poems and folklore about deer. And telling these stories draw people in. They tie food, place, and material remains to memories and stories. And it's not just what kind of archaeology do we do, it's what we do it with that matters. And I think a lot of these old folk tales are really important. I'm sure Barbara must have had lots when she was doing the Memorias project.
I was going to say, I don't know if Barbara is there, but we have a similar one with serpents that drink milk. I think the snakes, right, that drink milk. Yeah, similar. Yeah, so far away and yet so so similar.
Yeah,
Stories are there. We just have to be interesting in knowing them and talking to people. They are there.
Yeah.
Still.
Yeah.
Does anyone want to comment something? Lesley is far away, but now he's close to us. Well, I don't know. But,
Can I make a question?
oh, yes, of course.
Do you think about recording the folk tales as well, besides the place names? You know that I work with both. That's why I'm asking, because sometimes they are so connected. I feel difficult in working with just the place names, because sometimes you have the legends that explain the place names. So it's really important.
It's really important. And I haven't done any of this work. All I've done is play on an art project with some
Can I
students
go?
that summer.
Can I go?
But it's really important. And people give you the avenues that you should pick up and follow. So, for example, it was on the visit to the excavation last summer. 6 people came up to me and said, do you know about the local group that traces family names and place names? No. And then you think about it, and yeah, it's important. Yeah, I will.
Yes, it's important.
Um,
Barbara?
Yes, sorry, I'm here. Just to pick up a little bit to comment these place names, research and record. Here in the Coa Valley, it's one of the, one of the main and richest heritage that we have, and it's it's disappearing very, very fast because people are just the old people that lived in these lands, because we have huge, not like in Aram, Iceland, it's a very small land, a very small island. But as you know, here in the Douro, we have huge areas of, land that was, people were walking through, moving around, but not living all the time. Not lots of people were experience that landscape on a daily way. So there's not a lot of people that have this, not a lot of people still alive, unfortunately, that have this knowledge of knowing the place names and different ways of calling things. That is also a very interesting thing that Lesley was saying. It's not only about putting a name or a point in the landscape, or a person that is connected to it, but also all the variety of these place names, because we call it valley, but people here have 3-4 ways of calling a valley or a small river, and it's all some kind of language that has completely disappeared from our lexicons. So what we have been doing here in the Landcraft project recently, it was record with the people that were shepherding in these lands, walking in this place every single day, and cartograph again all the names and all these lexicas, like a new dictionary. So far we have work on a small scale area around the archaeological sites, but the idea is to move forward. And we have already a great map with these names, and now we need to, unfortunately, it was very difficult to recover the narratives around these places, the legend, the meanings of the names, why they call it like that, what stories are connected to these places. So unfortunately, it's too late to do that, but we have the place names, and it has been one of the main efforts that we have been doing in this project. So just to tell you that a little bit what we have been doing in the Landcraft. Not only that, but talking about this, and also involving people on the archaeological side, these people that we have been working with, and trying to at least not, trying to recover historical knowledge of these places, because unfortunately is lost. We just only have their own experience of the place and what they have inherited, but also create new narratives. So, like, what are we doing? The new meanings, the new discoverings around this place, or archaeological site, and make people again trying to find new meanings around these places, and not being just, how do you say, João, ajuda-me, afastados, estão afastados. So they have been not forced, like in your island, forced to get away from these places, but unfortunately, somehow rewilding projects are creating a border to these landscapes.
Isso é
Yeah.
verdade.
So I think archaeology in this case could be a way to, you know, create an open door between what is the memory of this landscape and what is the future of this landscape.
Yeah, I agree.
Okay.
Thank you, Barbara. Does anyone want to say something? Or in Cambridge it's 1 hour more, isn't it?
No, I think
it's
we're
the
at
same. Yes,
time.
of course, it's the same. It's the same. Yes. It's because I'm getting hungry. So no, I'm joking.
Yeah.
So does anyone want to say something?
Yes, I would like to say something. I want to thank Lesley for giving this, and to my professor to make me come to this. It didn't make me come, but he told me about this because this gave me a new point of view, that is archaeology with ecology. I didn't think about it, and I accompany a project in Valdocoa about rewilding. It's rewilding Portugal. I accompany for some time now, and I never thought about archaeology and ecology mixing together. Never come to my mind, and this made me think about it. And as a student, I think it's very important to see these new points of views. And I also like the part of contemporary archaeology. I don't know if I said it right, but because it's also that it's something that are not do a lot. We never care about the contemporary day. The people that live closest to us. Sometimes it's the people that are more forgotten, and I thought it was very interesting. So thank you a lot.
Thank you, Ricardo.
Obrigado, Ricardo. So I think we can close. It's 7 o'clock. I want to thank you again, Lesley, for your very, very, very interesting presentation, and for well, and when you started, and then when you were speaking in the finish of your presentation, you saw something that I think it's beautiful in a poetical sense, that it was the archaeology of care. And I think that we can finish with that idea and doing not only archaeology, but archaeology of care. Care for people, care for the landscape, care for the other archaeologists.
John, can I tell you a truthful story to end? Madalena, who was with me last year on my research leave on the island, was not at all, this is my daughter, everyone, she was not at all interested in the prehistory, not even at Machrie Moor. But when Madalena got to the farm at Machrie Moor, she was there for hours. And she said, "Mum, why don't you care about this building? And look, it has shelves and a fireplace, and it's full of stories." And she became the tour guide of the farmhouse and told me all these wonderful stories, my sister and I, all these wonderful stories about it. And then when I started to be interested in the history of the Drumadoon farm, it was, oh my God, that farm is outside the scheduled area and children care about it more than archaeologists. So I might sound poetic now. I might have desperately tried to find the poetry about those farms now for all of you. But it was my daughter that said care. But yeah. So
we need to thank
her.
Okay,
thank
so
you everyone for
again,
listening.
thank you. Thank you very
you,
much.
Lesley.
Thank you very much.
Thank you. It was
Hope-
really, really
Lesley.
inspiring. Come
Hope to see
to
you soon.
Portugal soon.
Next month.
We'll
Okay,
keep-
I hope there'll be some trips to Scotland too.
Yeah,
I
Yes,
want
let's
hope
do.
so.
volunteer.
Okay.
Thank you very much. Bye.
So much.
Bye-bye.